daily breaches of the Gaza ceasefire agreement threaten the entire peace process, says Qatar's prime minister, who helped broker the deal forged by Donald Trump. So what's gone wrong and what might the US president do to get it back on track? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. When he announced the Gaza ceasefire deal in October, US President Donald Trump declared it the historic dawn of a new Middle East. It was welcomed worldwide and brought rare unity between China, Russia and the West. But Qatar, a major broker between Israel and Hamas, says the entire process is now under threat. It's blaming Israel's daily ceasefire breaches for jeopardizing the pact that ended more than 2 years of war and genocide. Israel, in turn, accuses Hamas of refusing to disarm as envisaged in the agreement. Other major hurdles include the formation of an international stabilization force charged with Gaza's security and how the Strip will be governed. So, with warnings that his centerpiece foreign policy deal is under threat, what will Trump do to save it? What's the thinking and strategy of Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as that of Hamas? We'll discuss all of this with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
Saeed Abdin was born during the ceasefire in Gaza. He lived for less than a month, but never really knew peace. His home was a frayed nylon tent. And even though his parents wrapped him in 4 blankets to protect him, it wasn't enough.
I was willing to trade my soul to save him. We arrived at the hospital, waited for a bus, and they took him to intensive care. They said, he is very cold. The tents are very cold.
Saeed is one of at least 15 Palestinians who have died in the past 2 weeks from hypothermia or buildings collapsing in the heavy rain and strong winds. Israel is accused of weaponizing the winter weather, blocking the entry of mobile homes and sustainable shelters, severely limiting humanitarian aid. Palestinians are also in danger from Israel's ongoing attacks. Troops opened fire in multiple locations across the Strip on Thursday, killing a child. In a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State, Qatar's prime minister warned Israel's near-daily violations are threatening the peace process.
We stress the urgent need to deliver humanitarian aid to Gaza unconditionally and to move immediately to the second phase of the agreement to end the war, as delays and ceasefire violations endanger the entire process and place mediators in a difficult position.
The second stage is meant to see Israel withdraw from Gaza, a new interim authority installed, and an international stabilization force assuming security control. But the process is fraught. Israel has violated the terms of the ceasefire at least 738 times since it came into effect on October the 10th. Its attacks have killed at least 394 Palestinians and wounded more than 1,000. The breaches reached a critical point when Israeli forces assassinated a senior Hamas commander in Gaza City last weekend. Al Jazeera's White House correspondent asked President Donald Trump if he'd reprimanded the Israeli prime minister.
Was that a violation of the ceasefire, the strike on the Hamas general?
We're going to have to see. We're looking into that. Yeah, we'll look into it.
The diplomats may have time, but the people of Gaza don't. The UN says at least 30,000 children are trying to survive in storm-damaged makeshift shelters. Temperatures are forecast to drop even further in the coming days. Pediatricians are warning that more babies will die, and Israel is showing no signs of allowing in what they need to survive. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's now bring in our guests for today's Inside Story. Joining us from Doha is Tamer Qarmout, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. In London is Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli negotiator. And Rami Khouri is a distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut. He joins us from Boston, Massachusetts. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Before we get into the details of the Trump plan, I want to get your overall view first of where things stand on the current ceasefire and the prospects of moving to phase two. Tamer, Qarmout, when you look at the current conditions and the situation in Gaza, is this ceasefire still a meaningful pathway towards phase two of the Trump plan?
Folly, a very good question. And the answer is, as long as there is no other alternative, it remains holding. And yes, indeed, I mean, the scenes we see from Gaza are horrifying, but the alternative is the return of war. But one has to be optimistic that things will move forward somehow. It's a very complex situation when it comes to the negotiation process and moving from these very intertwined, complicated stages. Stage one is over, with Hamas handing the Israeli captives. Israel, of course, as indicated in your report, is in violation of almost everything when it comes to phase one, especially allowing enough aid to enter, the daily killing, targeted attacks. But again, I mean, the war in its ugly shape has stopped. And I think we have to, all actors have to preserve this to make sure that there will not be a return to the shape of war as we have seen it and lived it over the last 2 years. But I remain cautiously optimistic. I know the devil is in the details, but I think diplomacy and shuttle diplomacy will kick and become more engaged in this critical junction now.
So you're cautiously optimistic, Tamer. Daniel Levy in London, are you as cautiously optimistic as Tamer? I mean, are we still on track towards phase two, or has Israeli policy, whether deliberate or reactive, put that transition to phase two in jeopardy?
I wish I could share Tamer's cautious optimism. I cannot. I think this was a plan by design which allows Israel to maintain its control. And yes, one should be thankful that there are Palestinians not being killed in the triple digits every day, but it's bad enough that there are Palestinians being killed every day. So phase two, if by phase two we mean a board of peace is announced with some names of leaders, perhaps the former prime minister of the country I'm in, the UK, who are going to further decenter Palestinian self-governance and agency. If we mean by phase two an international force which serves Israel's interests and fails to protect Palestinians, or perhaps one that just sits in this command center that already exists inside Israel, if by phase two we mean ignoring practical plans that have been put forward by the Hamas organization for how the issue of disarmament could be bedded into a better reality, those things, ignoring that, could happen if we mean by phase two.
Okay, we'll get into the details.
Let me finish, if I may, fully. If we mean the continuation of Palestinians being killed every day, of crimes every day, the continuation of occupation of 50% plus of Gaza, the continuation of not allowing aid in, of the miserable conditions, that Israel acts with impunity still, no accountability, and that there is no respect for Palestinian rights, that is not a phase two anyone should desire.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And we will get into the details of the stumbling block and the different phases and what they entail. Rami, let me come to you and get your overall view of where things stand. Daniel, not as optimistic as Tamer. What about you? Do you still see this as a peace process moving forward? And how do regional dynamics right now shape whether phase two of the Trump plan can realistically happen?
Yeah, thank you, Femi, and thanks for having me. This is a fascinating moment historically and politically. There are most of the issues that Daniel particularly mentioned. I agree with that. It's the evidence of what is actually happening in U.S. and Israeli policy, which is what drives everything in the region, is negative and problematic. If there's no sign of a change towards a more even-handed law-based and legitimate process that responds to the equal rights of Israelis and Palestinians, then there will be no hope for anything to come out of this. At the same time, what we've seen in the last 3-4 months is a fascinating interruption, a limited interruption in the century-long colonial assault on Palestine by the Zionist movement, the State of Israel, and their main Western supporters and armorers and funders and protectors, which was the UK first, now mostly the US. The new element here is there are elements in the proposal by Trump and Netanyahu, and this was an Israeli-American proposal, there are elements that are attractive, talking about a pathway to a Palestinian state involving people like Turkey and Arab countries and Pakistan and Indonesia in monitoring mechanisms. These are new elements that have never happened, but they haven't succeeded to really break the colonial pattern of what's going on. And the leaks that have come out about what's going to possibly happen in phase 2 with the Board of Peace and the Executive Committee is that this is a continuation of both criminal activity and carpetbagging by Western ex-officials or non-officials who have given this extraordinary opportunity to shape the future of the region, make a lot of money, and maintain a perpetual colonial hold.
Rami, let me ask you about the Qatari Prime Minister's warning. Is that warning meant to pressure Washington to discipline Israel and Netanyahu, or to reposition Qatar as a broker of last resort?
I think the Qatari Prime Minister's warning is not just about the peace process. I think it's a warning about the limited sovereignty of Arab countries and other global South countries in playing a role. And it's a warning about the collapse of the international rule of law and the institutions and norms that were set after World War II, mostly as a response to the genocide against the Jews, which the world agreed and still agrees should never happen again, except it's happening again in Palestine, and it's mostly being done by the Jewish state, as they call themselves, Israel, with enthusiastic support. That's the fear. It's not the ceasefire hasn't been implemented. There's partial implementation. The fear is that the structure of rational relationships and decent human postures among people in the region, and particularly by the global powers, that's collapsing very rapidly. And it's what the Zionist movement in Israel have deliberately tried to do, whether it's the UN or the ICC or freedom of speech in American campuses. Anywhere you look, the traditional norms are collapsing, and Gaza is the Gaza genocide is one of the biggest drivers of this.
Tamer, Qarmout, what are Hamas's incentives in its strategic thinking right now? Is continuing the ceasefire useful for some humanitarian respite, even if we know that that hasn't been the case in Gaza, given what we've seen happen? Or is there a longer-term political strategy here?
I don't think Hamas has a longer-term political strategy. I don't think the Palestinian leadership or representative have any longer-term strategies. The fact that that till now we have a very fractured Palestinian politics, and we have an ongoing split. And despite all the prices Gaza have paid, the West Bank has paid, it's disastrous. I mean, when it comes to national unity and the lack of national unity at this very critical stage, I'm not sure why is Hamas negotiating alone in this process.
Yeah, I mean, what about the Palestinian Authority? Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Where is the Palestinian Authority in all this?
And that's my point. Yes, with all respect to Daniel and Rami, I totally agree with what they said. But the matter when it comes to ordinary Gazans here, it's survival now. We're not even in this colonial debate or post-colonial debate and whether the world is ideal or free. What matters for me as a Gazan, as a Palestinian now, that we have a small window that has opened to end the genocidal war now. It's not ending the suffering or misery of Palestinians at all. We have a UN Security Council resolution that is endorsed. We have, for the first time since the Arab Spring, a real engagement by 60 countries, most of them are Arab and Muslim countries, to try to push forward something to end this war. We're not talking about even a political process to bring back the Palestinian-Israeli statehood project. None of these are on the table. What matters for me now is that we don't have any, Gazans do not have any other alternatives but this miserable situation now, given that this war has been so unfair to them and there is no ideal politics in real world. So this is why what I'm saying it from a very political perspective is that's it, the way it is happening now. It is this ugly way. It's happening in this ugly, unfair way. And we have to stick to some hope. And some hope, this active diplomacy. I'm glad that Qatar and Turkey is there. Egypt is there. They're pushing with the Americans. Trump also have this fascination of being a peacemakers. Let's hope things happen somehow in the minimalist even way. If it is
let's allow Daniel to respond.
Move on from there, yeah.
Daniel, respond to what Tamer has just said there.
One cannot disagree with Tamer's bottom line. Of course not. We don't want to see a return to where we were 3 months ago, but we also don't want to see ourselves stuck where we are now. So I think the important thing to focus on is not to go along if they say, well, here are the names on the board of peace, and there's all these countries in this coordination center in an Israeli city in the south. That's the next phase. What one has to do is focus on the fact that 600 aid trucks per day, which is a bare minimum given the destruction Israel has conducted, 600 aid trucks were committed to. The average that has been allowed in since the so-called ceasefire is less than 125. That should not be allowed to continue. Israel's feet should be held to the fire on that one. Israel continues to kill Palestinians every day. Israel continues to occupy that area. What, for me, are the telltale signs, Folly? The telltale signs are that in this, even by Israeli standards, most extreme government in history, no one is saying there's a problem with this deal because the deal does not challenge Israel's most maximalist position. What is another telltale sign? That no one is saying, what about accountability for Israel's war crimes? Who pays, by the way? What about compensation? What about Israeli assets held overseas? And we're not even seeing fully the media being given access to Gaza. You guys, you're brave, courageous journalists, Hind al-Khouri, etc. They're still there, but other media outlets are not in there. And I would suggest that it's not good enough.
Not being held to the fire, Daniel, let me ask you about that and the U.S.'s role, and specifically President Trump's role here. U.S. officials are reportedly said to have sent a sharp message to Netanyahu after the Riyadh Sad strike, warning him not to, quote, ruin President Trump's plan and reputation over this deal. Do you think this signals a shift? And do you think, the fact that Trump seems to have tied this plan to himself, to his political sustainability, perhaps, that could put pressure on Netanyahu?
My bottom line fully would be no, because President Trump lives in a world of his own creation and an echo chamber that promotes that. He tells us that after 3,000 years, there is peace in the region. So we have to be very clear that we've heard it before. This is what we heard from President Biden for all those. I'm frustrated. I'm sending them strong messages. What else are you sending them? You're sending them endless supplies of weapons, of money. You're going after the International Criminal Court because they want to hold Israel accountable. You actually pushed through at the UN Security Council a criminal resolution, 2803, which conditions basic Palestinian rights. So that is the reality. There's another reality which we should also acknowledge. And that's where maybe there is an opening here, which is there is a fight, an unprecedented debate inside the American right, inside the MAGA movement, where people there are calling out. And now this is getting its own echo chamber and mass following. The idea that America first is not Israel first. That why is America still being led by the nose by an Israeli prime minister? And the other potential tool that we have is, as was mentioned by Tamer. You do have this group of 8 Arab and Muslim majority states who Trump presented the original plan to. You do have this involvement and engagement of other actors, but this does not yet translate into a set of plans and to speaking in one voice and to using their leverage with the administration.
All right, Rami, Khouri, your thoughts about what Daniel said there, and you know, on Trump's support for Israel and the pressure he's facing within his MAGA movement. How do you think that might cost him within the movement and the Republican Party if he doesn't rein in Netanyahu?
Well, I agree with Daniel on most of what he says, as I usually do, and Tamer as well. I agree, and I've spoken and written about this, that there are new elements here in this process, and one of them is the unpredictable nature of Trump and what he's doing. But Trump, the policies that Trump has actually implemented, which is the only way we can judge any of these actors, by their actual work on the ground, not what they say, not statements, not meetings, but what they've actually done. And what Trump has done in his policies is provide a package of policies that are policies and individuals that are colonial, criminal, runaway capitalist, and totally oblivious to the rights of the Palestinians in any significant term. And this is the real problem, that there's no sign that there's going to be any significant change. We've also had evidence from the relations with Iran, relations with the Gaza and the ceasefire, that the U.S. and Israel have colluded behind the scenes to produce a facade of collaboration, pressure on Israel, etc., whereas at the bottom line, they're working together to conclude what they're doing. So my conclusion is that there's 2 things we got to watch out for. When will American political leaders feel the pressure of the opposition to the Israeli-American genocide and start to change their policies? And that process is underway, as Daniel mentioned. The second thing we have to look out for is how many more ways will the Zionist movement and the State of Israel, with full American and British support, find ways to kill Palestinian babies? The latest one is to freeze them to death. They burned them to death. They shredded them with quadcopters. They starved them to death. They've shot them to death. What's the next one? How will Zionism and the U.S. kill more Palestinian babies? The more that happens, the more that the global South and the rational people in the West and the North respond. And we're seeing movement on both of those fronts. So that's what I would watch for.
Okay, gentlemen, let's take a closer look now at some of the stumbling blocks of the plan and getting it to the next phases of it. The next phase, Phase 2, calls for the disarmament of Hamas, the withdrawal of Israeli troops, the establishment of an interim international stabilization force, the ISF, for Gaza, and the way forward, and of course, the establishment of a state, right? Tamer, let me come to you. What do you see as the biggest stumbling block? There's been a lot of talk about this ISF, the International Stabilization Force, with the participation of countries like Turkey and so on. And in recent days, there's been talk of a rapprochement between President Trump and the Turkish President Erdogan. How do you see that affecting the formation of the stabilization force?
I think, from Hamas's perspective and my readings from the statements coming from Hamas leaders, for this disarmament to happen, I think they would trust to see close allies or friendly countries more or less present in the Strip and in charge of the process. They don't want to hand it over to some other parties they don't trust, or the Israelis per se. But I think, again, for me, these are technical details. What worries me most is that this is happening in isolation of the West Bank, of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, of a unified Palestinian house. We don't want this transitional authority to be a permanent, if it happens, to be a permanent structure that governs Gazans and deprives Palestinians from their rights of statehood, of freedom, etc. So what worries me is mainly this element, not the technicalities of disarming Hamas or etc. I think Hamas understands it's in a very weak position. It
Right.
wants to remain politically active in Palestinian politics, and it should, because it's a mainstream political party. No one can take this right from them. But they have also to focus on the urgent and very pressing needs of Gazans, because as we talk as well, displacement is happening in a very soft way, if I want to put it this way. Gazans are leaving, the Israelis are helping them to leave. We don't want this to be a very long, painful process where to see the population decreasing in numbers and nothing is happening.
Okay.
But back to the thing is, again, all these things are not tied to a bigger political project.
Right.
To bring Palestinians together and to see what's the end game of this entire peace process, if I want to put it this way.
Okay, Daniel Levy, what do you see as the biggest stumbling blocks? And also, if phase 2 fails to materialize by early 2026, what next? Do we see a resumption of a full-blown conflict, a full-blown war, or do we see a frozen stalemate with the continuing humanitarian crisis?
That's a good question, Folly. I think the main stumbling block is, predictably enough, that Israel has no intention of withdrawing from the rest of Gaza. It controls more than 50%. It has no intention of allowing an international force that could in any way limit its freedom of maneuver to kill Palestinians, anything that would protect Palestinians. It has no intention of there being Palestinian legitimate agency and governance inside Gaza. And unless it is pushed and it is forced to accept those things, it will hold out. Senior Hamas officials have put forward what in any other conflict situation where the overarching reality of occupation and ongoing structural violence against the people denied their rights, what in any other situation would be considered very pragmatic proposals for how to move forward on the armaments question. But those are being totally ignored. So if this is what still holds in early 2026, I think the expectation should be somewhere between the two scenarios you put forward, Folly, which is that this becomes the permanent entrenched reality. And I think trying to push Palestinians into ever smaller zones, making their lives miserable, the stated Israeli governmental, amongst many of the ministers' goals of ethnic cleansing and displacement, still remains that goal, with occasional forays into even greater violence, even more death, and Folly, of course. We focused our conversation on Gaza, but we haven't mentioned the ongoing criminality and the escalation of that criminality of settlements, displacement and destruction
in the occupied West Bank. Thank you for that, Daniel. Rami, let me come to you finally for the final word. How do we move forward on those big issues, the stumbling blocks, the disarmament of Hamas, the creation of this international stabilization force? And same question to you. If phase 2 fails to materialize by early 2026, what next? What happens in Gaza?
I think the way to move forward is to actually implement in practice the promise of the agreements that have been reached so far, even with all of their deficiencies, imprecision, vagueness, and constant manipulation by the Israeli-American genocidal combine. There are important elements in the agreements that should be implemented, but there's no way that the Palestinians, the Arabs, the world has been able to push the powers who run this process, mainly the Americans, with some Europeans tagging on, to push them to be actually even-handed.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Story. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Tamer, Qarmout, Daniel Levy, and Rami Khouri, thank you for joining us. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.